What happens when a ruthless gang targets a frail, aging black veteran, thinking his solitude makes him an easy target, only to discover his son is a U.S. Army general? Watch as James Harrison, a man who's seen it all, and his son, General Marcus Harrison, fight back against the gang, only to uncover a deeper secret, one that has plagued the black community for far too long. Together, father and son will take on not just the hate, but a hidden network that has been silently tearing their community apart. James Harrison sat on the weathered wooden bench, the afternoon sun casting soft, dappled shadows across the park. At 68 years old, James had earned the right to enjoy moments like these, quiet, peaceful, free from the chaos of the world. His cane leaned against his leg, a silent reminder of his age, yet there was an undeniable strength about him. The gentle breeze tousled his graying hair as he leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on the trees swaying in the breeze, lost in thought. The park was filled with families enjoying their day, children laughing and playing in the distance. For James, this park wasn't just a place for solitude. It was a place of reflection. Once a soldier, he had seen his fair share of battles, not just on the battlefield, but in life. Every wrinkle on his face told a story, stories of war, sacrifice, and resilience. Now retired, he found solace in the simple moments. His military service, long behind him, had left him with memories of comrades lost, victories won, and a deep sense of duty that could never be shaken. James shifted slightly, feeling the weight of the years on his body, but his mind remained sharp. Despite the physical toll, he was far from helpless. A lifetime of challenges had built a resilience that no one could take away. He wasn't someone who easily folded, and he had long since learned the value of picking his battles. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, 3 young men appeared in his line of sight. They were walking with a swagger that immediately caught his attention. Their laughter cut through the serenity of the afternoon, their voices loud and intrusive. James noticed them but chose not to engage. He had seen this kind of behavior before, and he knew better than to make eye contact with trouble. The tallest of the 3, a wiry young man with a cocky grin, spotted James and nudged the others. James kept his gaze forward, his posture relaxed but alert. His instincts, honed over years of military training, told him that trouble was brewing. These were no boys. They were looking for a target, and James, sitting alone with his cane, looked like an easy mark. "Hey, old man," one of them called out, his voice loud enough to turn heads. James didn't react. He wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of a response. Instead, he shifted his gaze to the trees in front of him, letting the comments slide off like water on a duck's back. "Yo, Gramps, we're talking to you," another one chimed in, stepping closer with a mocking tone. Their sneakers scraped the pavement as they approached, the sound deliberately abrasive. James sighed softly, his fingers tightening around the handle of his cane. It wasn't fear that made him tense, it was annoyance. He had come here for peace, and they were ruining it. His hand gripped the cane slightly tighter, a subtle warning to himself. "What's the matter? Too deaf to hear us, or just too stuck up to say hello?" The leader sneered, leaning forward, his crooked smile spreading across his face. James turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto the group. His voice was calm but firm, a quiet authority cutting through the tension. "Afternoon, gentlemen." The casual response caught them off guard. Their laughter faltered for a moment, but as if to recover, the leader smirked, clearly trying to assert dominance over James. "Gentlemen, that's rich. But we're not here for niceties, old man. We're here to remind you who runs this place." James didn't flinch. He simply studied them with a calm, unwavering gaze. He wasn't a man who was easily intimidated. He'd faced far worse in his life than these 3. He had learned long ago that silence could be as powerful as a well-timed strike. He allowed the leader's words to settle in the air, giving him nothing but a stoic silence in return. The leader, emboldened by the silence, took another step forward, his 2 companions flanking him. Their movements seemed choreographed, a deliberate effort to surround James on all sides. The afternoon sun highlighted their youthful arrogance, their postures confident, but James didn't back down. He knew that what they were really looking for was fear, something they wouldn't find here. "What exactly do you want?" James asked, his voice low yet clear. The leader chuckled, glancing back at his companions, as if they were all in on some inside joke. He turned back to James. What do we want, huh? You're sitting in the wrong park to ask that question. Don't you know your place? James raised an eyebrow, his grip on his cane tightening slightly. And what place would that be? The leader's face twisted into a sneer. Anywhere but here. You see, guys like us, we don't take kindly to outsiders trying to act like they belong. His words were veiled in racism, but James could read between the lines. He wasn't surprised. The hate in this young man's voice was all too familiar. This park is open to everyone, James replied, his tone measured. But I'm guessing that's not really what this is about, is it? One of the others, a stocky man with a shaved head, barked a laugh. Look at him, trying to play dumb, like he doesn't know exactly why we're here. James didn't react to the laughter. He merely met their challenge with silence, a steady gaze that pierced through their bravado. I'd rather hear it from you, he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through their noise. The leader smirked, crossing his arms as he leaned in closer. You want to hear it? Fine. People like you think you can just walk around, acting like you own the place, like we're supposed to just stand by and take it. James's grip on his cane tightened, his calm demeanor hiding a simmering anger beneath the surface. You think I need to learn something? He asked, his voice soft but firm. No, the leader sneered. I think it's you who needs the lesson. He gestured to his companions, signaling them to close in. James straightened slightly, his eyes never leaving the leader's face. I won't be intimidated by a bunch of cowards. The leader's smirk didn't fade. Cowards? You think we're the cowards here? No, James replied. I know what cowards look like, and it's you. The tension in the air thickened as the three young men closed in on James. Their words had turned from mockery to something more sinister, more dangerous. The leader, still grinning that wide, arrogant grin, advanced toward James as if daring him to flinch. You look real comfortable here, old man, the leader sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. Like you think this place belongs to you. James didn't rise to the bait. He remained seated, calm and composed, as he studied the young men who surrounded him. There was no fear in his eyes, just a quiet, unshakable resolve. This park is open to everyone, he said simply, his voice low but steady. The leader took another step forward, his companions flanking him on either side. Yeah, right, he scoffed. But guys like us don't take kindly to people like you thinking they can just waltz in and act like they own the place. James let the words hang in the air, refusing to react. The more the leader talked, the more his true intentions became clear. This wasn't about the park or about who belonged where. It was about something much deeper. It was about hatred, about entitlement, and about the idea that some people believed they could impose their will on others. You want to show me my place? James asked, his voice colder now, his grip tightening around the cane. He had been patient, but his patience was wearing thin. Yeah, the leader said, a cruel smile on his lips. You need to know your place. This park isn't for people like you. James shook his head slowly, his expression unwavering. You don't get it, do you? His voice was quieter now, but there was steel in it. This park belongs to everyone, and I've earned my right to sit here, same as anyone else. The stocky man on the right barked a laugh, taking a step forward. Look at him, all high and mighty. What's next, Gramps? You gonna teach us some lesson about how we're supposed to respect you? He took another step closer, his fists clenching at his sides. James's gaze never wavered. He knew where this was heading, but he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. His silence was his weapon, his calm a defiance they hadn't expected. It was the kind of calm that came from years of experience, years of surviving much worse than petty street thugs. James had seen hatred before. He had fought against it in the trenches, had fought beside men who were lost in wars they could never win. This, however, was not a war. It was a moment, a small battle, one that James would win by sheer will. I fought for this country, James said, his voice soft but heavy with meaning. I've earned my place, and I'll be damned if I let you tell me where I can sit. The leader's expression faltered for a moment, the mockery vanishing from his face as James's words hit their mark. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by a flicker of anger. The leader took another step forward, his fists tightening at his sides. And then, without warning, he lunged at James. The stocky man followed suit, charging at James from the side. The wiry man, still a few steps behind, moved to flank him, his eyes scanning for an opening. They weren't just trying to intimidate him anymore. They were about to make him regret sitting there. James braced himself, his cane now firmly in his grip. He was ready. Despite his age, despite the pain that often crept into his joints, James had not lost the sharpness of his mind. His training, his experience, were still with him. He had fought battles, won battles, and seen things most men could never comprehend. But what he faced now was different. This was about more than just survival. It was about standing firm, about showing these men that their hate couldn't break him. It wouldn't break him. As the stocky man closed in, James shifted his weight, sidestepping just as the man swung his fist. The blow missed by inches, but James didn't waste the opportunity. With a practiced move, he swung his cane low, knocking the stocky man's legs out from under him. The thug stumbled, falling hard onto the ground with a grunt. The wiry man, seeing his companion fall, rushed forward with a wild swing, aiming for James's head. But James was ready. He ducked just in time, the punch narrowly missing him. And then, using the man's momentum against him, James grabbed his arm, twisting it with surprising strength. The wiry man let out a sharp yelp of pain as he was sent stumbling forward, crashing into the ground with a loud thud. For a moment, the leader hesitated. His two companions were on the ground, groaning in pain, but James was still standing. Despite his age, despite the weariness that crept into his bones, James was still there. He wasn't backing down. The leader's eyes narrowed in frustration, and he lunged at James again, this time more carefully. His movements were faster, sharper, but James was just as quick. He sidestepped once more, narrowly avoiding the leader's blow, and jabbed his cane into the man's ribs. The leader staggered back, a sharp gasp escaping his lips as he clutched his side. "You think you're tough, huh?" the leader sneered, wiping the blood from his mouth. "You're nothing. You're just an old man." James's eyes never left his face. "I'm not the one who's afraid," he said softly, "but you will be." The wiry man, recovering from his fall, charged again, this time attempting to sweep James's legs out from under him. James anticipated the move, shifting just enough to avoid the full impact. The wiry man lost his balance, and James used the opportunity to strike, his elbow crashing into the man's back with a satisfying thud. The leader was on his feet now, more enraged than before. He motioned for the stocky man to get up, and together they advanced on James again. This time they moved in tandem, their attacks calculated and brutal. James could feel the strain on his body, but he didn't flinch. He was trained for this, and no matter how old he was, no matter how much his body protested, he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him fall. The stocky man swung low, aiming for James's legs, while the leader aimed for his head. James ducked the first blow, but the second one hit his shoulder with a force that nearly sent him sprawling. Pain shot through his body, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through it, retaliating with a sharp kick to the stocky man's knee. The gang was closing in, their movements becoming more erratic as they realized that James wasn't going down easily. The leader let out a frustrated roar, charging at James with everything he had. But James was ready. With a sharp exhale, he straightened, his voice calm but resolute. "You picked the wrong man." And just as the leader swung with all his might, James sidestepped, his body swaying with the fluidity of someone who had fought many battles before. The leader missed, and James seized the opportunity. He brought his cane down hard against the leader's back, sending him crashing to the ground. But before James could catch his breath, the wiry man was back on his feet, charging once more. This time, Marcus's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, cutting through the tension. "Enough!" The park seemed to fall into a tense silence after James's last strike. The air was thick with the smell of dust and sweat, the faint hum of distant voices now drowned out by the sound of heavy breathing and shuffling feet. James stood tall despite the pain that was beginning to settle in his joints, his cane now a weapon at the ready. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the movements of the three young men surrounding him. The wiry man, still recovering from James's elbow to the back, staggered back to his feet, eyes wide with rage. The stocky man was slowly getting up as well, clutching his knee and cursing under his breath. The leader, his face twisted in disbelief and frustration, wiped the blood from his mouth and glared at James. They had thought they could overwhelm him, but James Harrison wasn't the weak, frail old man they'd hoped for. Before the leader could bark another command to his companions, a voice boomed from behind them. "Stand down!" The voice was deep, commanding, and full of authority, one that instantly commanded respect. The three young men froze, their faces contorting in confusion as they turned to face the source of the voice. Marcus Harrison stood at the edge of the park, his tall, broad frame cutting a commanding figure against the backdrop of the fading sun. His military bearing was unmistakable, and his eyes, dark, sharp, and unyielding, locked onto the group of men with a focus that made them falter. His presence was like a silent storm, gathering force, and the three men immediately realized they had underestimated the situation. "What's going on here?" Marcus's voice was calm, yet it carried a weight that could crush anyone foolish enough to challenge him. He stepped forward, his boots firm against the pavement, the sharpness in his eyes unmistakable. The leader, still reeling from the shock of being confronted by someone even more imposing than himself, sneered in defiance. "You don't know who you're dealing with," the leader spat, trying to regain some sense of control. "We don't take orders from anyone." Marcus didn't flinch. His gaze never wavered. "You're making a mistake," he said flatly, his voice cutting through the tension. "You need to walk away from my father." For a moment, the gang members hesitated. The wiry man glanced at the leader, his face filled with uncertainty. The stocky man, still wincing from the pain in his knee, shot a nervous look at Marcus, clearly intimidated by his presence. The leader, however, stood his ground, trying to project an air of confidence. "What, you think you can just walk in here and handle us all?" he sneered. "This is our town, old man." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. The arrogance in the leader's voice only fueled his determination. "You've made a very bad decision," he said, his tone low and steady, every word laced with quiet power. Just then, the leader, desperate to salvage the situation, made his move. He lunged toward Marcus, throwing a wild punch aimed at his face. But Marcus, moving with the precision of someone trained for moments like these, sidestepped the blow with ease. He didn't need to fight them, he just needed to end it. In one fluid motion, Marcus grabbed the leader by the arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to his knees. The wiry man, seeing the shift in the balance of power, rushed forward to intervene. But Marcus pivoted, slamming his elbow into the man's chest and sending him sprawling to the ground. The stocky man, his face twisted with rage and panic, swung his fist toward Marcus, but Marcus was faster. He blocked the blow, then countered with a sharp jab to the man's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. The stocky man staggered back, gasping for air, too dazed to fight back effectively. In mere moments, the three men, who had just moments ago felt they had the upper hand, were reduced to a disorganized heap of frustration and pain. Their earlier bravado crumbled under Marcus's swift and calculated movements. It was clear now, these men were not in control. Marcus stood over them, his stance unyielding, as the leader, now pinned to the ground, struggled weakly. "You're done," Marcus said firmly, his voice cold. The leader's smirk had long faded, replaced by a desperate look in his eyes. He was realizing too late that he had miscalculated. "Stand down," Marcus repeated, his voice carrying the finality of an order. "You've lost." James, who had been watching from the sidelines, feeling the strain in his body but never once doubting his son, allowed himself a small, knowing smile. There was no fear in Marcus. There never had been. And for all the strength he had learned over the years, James knew that it was Marcus's presence that had sealed the deal. He was no longer just his son. He was a soldier, a man in his own right, and he had the ability to end this. As the leader, the stocky man, and the wiry man lay defeated on the ground, James hobbled over, his cane tapping the pavement with each slow step. He stood next to Marcus, his hand resting briefly on his son's shoulder in a gesture of pride and respect. "They thought they could get away with it," James said quietly, his voice steady despite the ache in his body. "But you were here." Marcus turned to face his father, his expression softening. "I wasn't about to let them hurt you, Dad," he said simply. Before they could say anything else, the sounds of sirens could be heard approaching in the distance. The police were on their way, drawn by the commotion. James and Marcus exchanged a glance, knowing that this was far from over. But for the moment they had won. And that victory, however small it seemed, in the grand scheme of things, meant something. "I'll make sure they don't get away with this," Marcus said, his tone hardening with resolve. James nodded in agreement. "This is just the beginning, son. We'll take them down one by one." Just as the sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of the police, the three men on the ground began to stir. The fight had left them, their confidence shattered in the face of Marcus's and James's resolve. The police cars pulled up with a screech, their flashing lights illuminating the darkening park. Officers spilled out, guns drawn, quickly assessing the scene. Two officers approached Marcus and James, their eyes scanning the three men on the ground, who were now being handcuffed by other officers. "General Harrison," one of the officers said, his voice respectful as he acknowledged Marcus's rank. "What happened here?" Marcus's expression remained steady. "These men attacked my father. They've been harassing people in this park for days. I intervened to stop them." The officer nodded, taking notes as the other officers moved to secure the scene. Marcus and James stood side by side, watching as the gang members were restrained and loaded into the back of the police cars. James turned to Marcus, a faint smile on his lips. "I knew you'd be here when I needed you." Marcus looked at his father, his eyes filled with respect. "You taught me how to fight, Dad. I'm just returning the favor." The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars illuminated the darkening park as the officers led the three gang members away in handcuffs. James and Marcus remained standing, watching the scene unfold, their minds already working on what came next. It wasn't just about stopping a few street thugs. It was about something bigger, much bigger. "Do you think this is over?" Marcus asked, his voice low and steady as he glanced at his father. James's gaze remained fixed on the police cars, now pulling away. His grip on his cane tightened slightly. "No," he said, his tone grim. "It's just the beginning." Marcus nodded in agreement. He knew what his father was thinking. He had seen it before, how a small group of miscreants could easily be a part of something much larger, something more insidious. They had been dealing with a symptom, not the root cause. "We need to find out who's behind them," Marcus said, his voice filled with determination. "This gang isn't acting alone. They're just a small part of something much worse." James turned to face his son, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. But these men, they're just the foot soldiers. They're not the ones calling the shots. We need to dig deeper, find out who's pulling the strings." The two men began walking toward the parking lot, their steps measured, their conversation flowing naturally between them. Marcus had always been a man of action, quick to take control and make decisions. But James's steady, methodical approach had always served them well. His wisdom, his ability to see the bigger picture, had guided them through many battles, both on and off the battlefield. And now it was his guidance that Marcus needed most. "Do you think we'll get anything out of them?" Marcus asked, his mind already moving to the next phase of the plan. James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the retreating police vehicles before looking back at Marcus. "It's possible," he said after a moment, "but these men are loyal to something more than just their leader. They'll protect whoever they're working for, even if it costs them." Marcus exhaled sharply. "It's going to take more than interrogation to break them." James's eyes narrowed, and he gave a slow nod. "You're right, but there's always a weakness. People like them always make mistakes. They think they're untouchable. They forget that someone's always watching." The conversation ended there as they reached Marcus's car. James got in slowly, his body aching from the earlier confrontation, while Marcus slid into the driver's seat, his eyes scanning the road ahead. The two of them were a study in contrasts, James with his quiet, unshakable resolve, and Marcus with his quick, decisive nature. But they worked in perfect harmony, a team forged through years of mutual respect and shared experiences. As they drove toward Marcus's office, Marcus's mind raced. The gang they had just dealt with was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. James's instincts were right. They weren't operating in isolation. They were part of a network, and if they were going to take it down, They needed to uncover every piece of it. The car slowed as they turned into the parking garage of the military compound. Marcus parked the vehicle, and the two men got out, heading straight for the building. Marcus's office was located on the upper floor, and as they entered, he immediately got to work. He pulled out his laptop, typing swiftly as he began pulling up records on the gang leader, the men they had subdued, and any possible connections they might have had. James sat at the desk across from him, watching with a quiet intensity. "You think you'll find something tonight?" he asked, his voice steady, yet filled with a quiet urgency. "I'll find something," Marcus replied, his eyes glued to the screen. "These guys think they can just wreak havoc in our communities without consequence, but they don't realize how much they've exposed themselves." Marcus scanned the reports, connecting dots, cross-referencing information, and pulling up security footage from the last few weeks. His fingers moved with precision, the same kind of precision he used in the field. He was like a hunter tracking his prey, every detail feeding into his strategy. James watched his son, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He had always been proud of Marcus, but moments like this reminded him of how much his son had grown. The years of military training had turned Marcus into a master strategist, someone who could see the bigger picture while others were focused on the small details. "It's not just about the gang," Marcus said, his voice breaking through James's thoughts. "They've got connections, people in high places. This isn't just some street-level operation. It's organized, it's political, and it's dangerous." James frowned, his hand resting on his cane. "I suspected as much. But who's pulling the strings? Who's funding them?" Marcus paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I'm looking at some of the phone records here. There's a name that keeps popping up. A man named Gary Hughes. He's the gang leader we just took down, but he's been tied to something much bigger. A network of hate groups operating in the region. Small cells, but they coordinate recruitment, propaganda, and even violence when they think they can get away with it." James's face darkened as he listened. "So this isn't just a random attack. They targeted you because of your service, because of what you represent." Marcus nodded grimly. "Exactly. They see me, they see you, and they see everything they hate. They want to tear it down, to destroy everything we've worked for." James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "And they think they can get away with it." "They do," Marcus said, his voice cold. "But they won't." James raised an eyebrow. "What's the plan?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled up a map on the screen, zooming in on locations around the city. "We start here," he said, pointing to a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town. "This is one of Gary's known associates. We've got records showing meetings there in the past. If they're desperate, it could be a fallback point or a stash house." James leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the desk. "And the bar you mentioned earlier?" Marcus clicked on another marker on the map. "It's a known gathering spot for hate groups. It's been flagged for hosting these people. I've got reports saying Gary's been seen there in the last month. If he's desperate enough, he might reach out to someone there." James nodded. "We start there then, but we do this smart. We don't rush in blindly." Marcus smirked faintly, his eyes flashing with determination. "Planning's my specialty, Dad." The days following their confrontation in the park were a blur of activity. Marcus and James spent hours reviewing intelligence, following leads, and piecing together the tangled web of connections that tied Gary Hughes and his gang to a much larger network. The threat they had uncovered wasn't just about one group of thugs, it was about an organized operation, one that had been silently growing and spreading its hatred across the region. James sat at the kitchen table of his modest home, his cane resting beside him. He was tired, but his mind was sharp. He wasn't used to feeling so helpless, not after a lifetime of battles. But this fight was different. It wasn't a fight he had prepared for, and it wasn't one he could face alone. That's where Marcus came in. Marcus, as always, was on his laptop, his fingers flying over the keys as he dug deeper into the network's operations. His mind was racing, processing every piece of information as he worked through the night. There were no shortcuts in this kind of investigation, no quick solutions. He needed to be patient, methodical. They had to get this right. The faint hum of the overhead fan was the only sound in the room, a soft, constant background to their quiet determination. For the first time in days, Marcus looked up from the screen, meeting his father's gaze across the table. "Dad," he said, his voice quiet but resolute, "I think I've got something." James raised an eyebrow. "What do you have?" Marcus turned the laptop toward him, showing a series of photos and documents. "Gary's been in contact with a network of hate groups. These aren't just isolated incidents. We're talking about recruitment, propaganda, and violence. And the connections go much higher than we initially thought." James leaned forward, scanning the screen with a frown. "How high are we talking?" Marcus clicked through a few more documents, pulling up information on a handful of individuals, each linked to Gary and his associates. These are people with power, connections in politics, business, even law enforcement. It's an underground network, but it's not small. They've been operating in the shadows, pulling the strings and setting up shop in places where no one can see them. James's expression darkened. "This isn't just a local problem anymore. This is a movement." Marcus nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I'm thinking. And we can't ignore it. We've already seen what they're capable of. They'll try to rally more people, recruit others, and push their agenda. If we don't act fast, it could get a lot worse." James exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around his cane. "So what's our next move?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he thought through their options. "We need to track their movements. They're operating in cells, so we start by taking down their safe houses. If we can hit them where it hurts, we'll destabilize the entire operation." James nodded in agreement. "We'll need backup. This isn't something we can do on our own." Marcus stood, pacing for a moment, his mind working quickly. "I've already reached out to a few people, contacts from my time in the military. We'll have support on the ground, but we need to be careful. These guys know how to cover their tracks. If we move too fast, we'll spook them. We need to be patient." "Patience isn't always my strong suit," James said with a slight smile, the weariness in his eyes softening just for a moment. "But I'll follow your lead." Marcus grinned faintly. "I wouldn't want it any other way, Dad." As they finalized their plan, they both knew that their window of opportunity was closing. The network wasn't going to sit idly by as they hunted down its members. They would fight back. They always did. But Marcus and James weren't intimidated. They had a history of fighting against impossible odds. This time, they would do it together. The next morning, the two of them gathered their things, ready to put their plan into motion. Marcus had already briefed his contacts, and a small team was set to meet them at the first location, an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. They knew Gary Hughes and his crew had used it as a stash house, but Marcus suspected it was more than just a safe spot. It was a hub for their activities, a place where they coordinated their operations and distributed their materials. The drive to the warehouse was quiet, the tension palpable. James leaned back in his seat, watching the scenery pass by as Marcus focused on the road. Both of them were lost in thought, the weight of what lay ahead hanging over them. As they neared the warehouse, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening. "Backup's in position," he said, his voice steady. James nodded. "Let's do this." The warehouse was located in a secluded area on the edge of town, far from any residential areas. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten by the world, abandoned, isolated, and perfect for people trying to operate under the radar. The only sound was the faint hum of the nearby highway and the occasional rustle of wind. Marcus parked the car a few blocks away, and the two of them walked the rest of the way in silence. They moved quickly and quietly, the years of military training kicking in. Every step was calculated, every movement precise. They weren't just going in to retrieve evidence, they were going in to shut down a dangerous network that threatened everything they stood for. They reached the warehouse just as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The area was still quiet, the darkness giving way to the light of a new day. But inside the warehouse, things were anything but peaceful. Marcus signaled to his team, and the small group of operatives fanned out, surrounding the building. They were armed, prepared for anything. Marcus glanced at James, who nodded in response. James wasn't as young as he used to be, but his mind was still sharp, and his instincts were still spot on. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready. "On my mark," Marcus whispered, his voice low but filled with authority. The team moved into position, and with a single hand signal, Marcus gave the command. The doors of the warehouse burst open and chaos erupted. The operatives moved quickly, taking control of the situation as Marcus and James entered the building. Inside, the scene was exactly what they had expected: a hub of activity, a network of individuals gathered together, preparing for something. There were crates filled with weapons, stacks of propaganda materials, and a group of men standing in the corner, their faces grim and determined. Marcus wasted no time. He approached the leader, a man who had been mentioned in the intel they had gathered, one of the higher-ups in the network. The man looked up in surprise, but it was too late. Marcus was already on him, his movements swift and decisive. "We've been looking for you," Marcus said coldly, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. "This is over." The man's eyes flickered with fear for just a moment before he masked it with defiance. "You don't know what you're getting into," he spat. "You can't stop us. We're everywhere." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. His team had already moved in, securing the area and arresting the others. As the operatives moved the men into custody, James stood off to the side, his cane resting against the wall. He watched as Marcus took control of the situation with ease, his military training evident in every move. For James, this was just another battle, a battle fought with determination, strategy, and the belief that no matter how hard the fight, it was always worth it. They had started this journey together, and together they would see it through to the end. The warehouse had been a critical point in their operation, but it wasn't enough to take down the entire network. Marcus and James had made their first significant strike, arresting several key members of the hate group, but they both knew the larger web was still intact. They had dismantled one piece, but the puzzle was far from complete. As the dust settled and their team began to secure the area, Marcus walked toward the crates filled with weapons and the piles of propaganda. James followed behind him, his cane tapping softly against the concrete floor. The air in the warehouse was thick with tension, the kind that came when you knew you had only scratched the surface of something much larger. "This is only the beginning," Marcus said, his voice filled with determination. "There's more out there, and it won't be long before they start retaliating." James gave a small nod, his expression thoughtful. "I know, but every piece we take down weakens them. Every piece we expose makes it harder for them to operate." Marcus stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the evidence. It was overwhelming: propaganda flyers, recruitment materials, weapons hidden in crates. This wasn't just about street-level violence. It was about an entire movement, one that had festered in the shadows, unnoticed by the general public. "We need to hit them harder," Marcus said, more to himself than to his father. "The network is bigger than we thought. These people are dangerous." James's voice broke through his thoughts, calm and steady as always. "What's the next move?" Marcus turned to face his father, his expression hard. "We start following the money. These groups don't operate for free. They've got funding, resources. If we can find where that's coming from, we can cut off the supply chain. If we take their funding, we take their power." James nodded, his eyes narrowing. "You're right, but we need to be careful. These men don't just run on money, they run on fear and loyalty. If we push too hard, we risk pushing them into a corner." "I'm not worried about them running," Marcus replied, his voice sharp. "I'm worried about the innocent people they'll hurt if we don't stop them. They're planning something bigger, something worse." As the team began to wrap up the operation at the warehouse, Marcus and James exchanged a brief, knowing look. They both understood that the stakes had just been raised. It wasn't just about bringing down a few criminals. It was about stopping an ideology, one that could spread further if left unchecked. The following day, Marcus and James were back at the military compound. They'd gathered their intel from the warehouse operation, but now they needed to move quickly. Marcus had already sent out feelers to his contacts, trying to trace the funding sources for the network. But they needed something concrete, something they could use to pull the strings and expose the entire operation. "Any luck on your end?" Marcus asked as he scanned through the intelligence reports that had just come in. James, seated across from him at the desk, scanned his own pile of paperwork. "A few leads, nothing concrete yet." Marcus grunted, his mind already racing. I'll follow up with the police. We've got to get those interrogation tapes from the men we arrested at the warehouse. Someone's bound to crack. James looked up, meeting his son's gaze. You think they'll talk? Gary Hughes is second in command, Marcus said, his voice low. He's the one who seemed the most rattled when we took him down. If we can get him to crack, we might find the money trail. James stood, his cane tapping lightly on the floor as he made his way over to Marcus's side. I know you want answers, but we have to be careful. If they find out we're onto them, they won't hesitate to retaliate. We're not just fighting criminals, Marcus. We're fighting an ideology, and that's not something that's easily defeated. Marcus nodded slowly, acknowledging his father's wisdom. I know. I've seen what they're capable of, but we can't let them win. Not this time. James placed a hand on his son's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. We won't, but we have to stay smart, and we need to make sure we're not fighting this battle alone. Just as Marcus was about to respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then turned back to James, his expression hardening. Got something, Marcus said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. It's from one of my contacts. They've traced a series of large transactions that have gone through shell companies. It's tied to Gary Hughes's group. But there's one name that keeps coming up, Thomas Dillard. He's been funding several of these operations. James raised an eyebrow. Who's Thomas Dillard? Marcus pulled up the information on his laptop. Dillard is a businessman with ties to several private security firms. He's been using these companies as a front to funnel money into these hate groups. He's been doing this for years. Looks like we've got a bigger fish to fry, James said, his voice tinged with both concern and determination. Marcus stood up, his mind already processing the next steps. We need to move quickly. Dillard is a key figure in all of this. If we can shut him down, we take out a huge portion of their resources. But we need to be careful. He's a businessman, which means he's likely well-connected. He won't be easy to reach. James gave a knowing nod. We've dealt with tougher situations before, but we need to be smart about how we approach this. He's got power, and he'll use it. Marcus stood tall, his military precision taking over as he began to make plans. I'll coordinate with my contacts in law enforcement. We'll need to gather more intel on Dillard's operation before we make a move. If we strike too soon, we risk tipping him off. James watched his son with a mix of pride and concern. Just be careful. These men aren't playing by the rules, and neither should we. But don't get reckless. Marcus smiled faintly, the fire in his eyes burning brighter. I won't. The investigation into Thomas Dillard had set off a chain reaction. The quiet businessman had proven to be more than just a peripheral figure in the hate group's operations. He was a linchpin, quietly fueling the group with the financial resources they needed to expand and continue their operations undeterred. Marcus and James had already gathered enough information to understand that dismantling Dillard's operation could cripple the network for good, but they knew they had to proceed with caution. Marcus was sitting at his desk, his laptop open as he reviewed Dillard's financial transactions. They had tracked a series of shell companies connected to him, each one acting as a funnel for funds directed to various hate groups and violent extremist activities. It was all carefully hidden behind layers of business dealings, but Marcus's military mind had already begun to connect the dots. We have to be careful about this, Marcus muttered, more to himself than to James, who sat in a chair across the room, watching him with a quiet intensity. Dillard's too well connected. If we go in too hard, too fast, we risk making him go underground, or worse, he could destroy the evidence. James leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp. You're right. We can't rush in blindly. But if we give him too much time, he'll slip away. We have to find the right balance between moving fast and staying hidden. Marcus nodded. I've already reached out to a few contacts. We have a few assets in place who can help us track his movements and get access to his private dealings. But Dillard's not stupid. He knows how to cover his tracks, and he'll have eyes everywhere. James gave a soft chuckle, leaning back in his chair. We've faced worse odds before, son. We can handle this. Marcus glanced at his father, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He had always been in awe of James's calm, unshakable presence. Even in the face of danger, his father never wavered. It was a trait Marcus had inherited, but James had perfected it over decades of experience. And now more than ever, That steadiness would be their greatest asset. "I know we can," Marcus replied, his voice firm. "But we need to move quickly. I've had my team start monitoring Dillard's financials. He's been moving large amounts of money into accounts linked to private militias and armed groups. If we can find out who he's been paying, we can trace it back to the core of the operation." James stood up slowly, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. "And we need to know where he's hiding the real power. These men always think they can get away with it. But when it's time to face justice, they'll have nowhere to run." Marcus's fingers hovered over his laptop keyboard as he pulled up more details on Dillard's connections. "There's a private estate in the hills, an old ranch that's been tied to him for years. It's secluded, out of sight. I suspect that's where he's been keeping all his key documents and records." James raised an eyebrow. "A safe house." "A fortress," Marcus corrected. "If we go after it, we need to be sure we have the element of surprise. This could be a major turning point. If we can get into that estate and secure the evidence, we'll have everything we need to shut him down." James thought for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, but we need more than just you and me. Dillard's not alone in this. We'll need backup, intelligence, firepower, and coordination." Marcus nodded. "I've already contacted my team. They'll be ready. I want to take him down cleanly, no mistakes. If we give him a chance to run, we could lose him for good." James placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm but steady. "We're not losing him. Not this time." The plan was set. Over the next few hours, Marcus coordinated with his contacts, lining up the necessary support and preparing for the operation. They couldn't afford to make a misstep. Dillard's estate was well guarded, and the man had been operating under the radar for years. But Marcus and James knew they had one thing the enemy didn't. They had each other, and they had the element of surprise. Later that evening, Marcus and James were in the car, headed toward the secluded ranch. The sky was darkening as the headlights cut through the winding roads leading into the hills. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the soft shuffle of papers as Marcus reviewed the final details of their plan. "You sure we're ready for this?" James asked, his voice steady, though a hint of concern flickered in his eyes. Marcus gave him a side glance, his expression unshakable. "We've been ready for this since the moment we decided to take down Gary Hughes. This is the final piece. Once we have Dillard, we'll have the whole network." James nodded. "Then let's finish this." The car reached the base of the hill where the ranch sat, its silhouette dark against the night sky. Marcus parked a safe distance away, and the two of them got out, quietly moving toward the compound. Marcus checked in with his team through his earpiece, coordinating the final approach. They couldn't afford to be seen or heard. Every move had to be executed with precision. As they crept closer to the estate, James's sharp eyes scanned the area. There were lights on in the main house, but they didn't seem to be alerting anyone to their presence. It was exactly what they had hoped for, a sense of complacency that came with thinking they were untouchable. Marcus signaled his team to move into position. They were already in place, waiting for the green light. The operation had to go off without a hitch. "On my mark," Marcus whispered, his voice steady. "We move in." As the team moved into position, Marcus and James stayed at the rear, their steps silent in the dark. They reached the back of the house and set up their equipment to break in. A few quick, quiet moves, and they were inside. The estate was vast, with rooms full of high-end furniture and lavish decor, but there was nothing here that was truly important. They were after the documents, the records that would tie Thomas Dillard to the hate groups and reveal the full extent of his operation. They moved through the estate methodically, room by room. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a locked door at the far end of the house. Marcus nodded to James, signaling that this was it, the heart of Dillard's operation. They had come this far. They weren't backing down now. Marcus took a deep breath before quickly unlocking the door. Inside, they found what they were looking for: documents, files, and maps detailing every single connection Dillard had. From the private militias to the hate groups he had been funding, it was all there. Everything they needed. "We've got him," Marcus said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "This is over." But as they were securing the evidence, Marcus's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, his face darkening. "Backups arrived," he said, his voice tightening. "We need to move fast. Dillard's not going down without a fight." Just as they began to leave the room, a voice echoed through the estate. "Move, move, move!" The moment Marcus and James stepped into the hallway, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from the other end of the estate. They weren't alone anymore. Dillard had clearly been prepared for the possibility of an attack. He wasn't going down without a fight. "Move! Move! Move!" The voice was sharp, frantic, and full of authority. The sound of men rushing into position grew louder, and Marcus's instincts immediately kicked in. They had to act fast, or they would be cornered. The element of surprise was slipping away with every second that passed. "Time to go," Marcus muttered, his voice steady as ever. Despite the rising tension in the air, his eyes flickered to James, who was already ahead of him, moving swiftly toward the exit. The older man had always been faster than anyone expected. They had the evidence they came for, Dillard's documents and financial records. And that was all that mattered. But Marcus knew they couldn't leave without a confrontation. Dillard wasn't going to let them walk out of his estate with that kind of evidence. The two of them moved quickly, slipping through the shadows like ghosts, their movements synchronized from years of practice. As they reached the back of the estate, Marcus pulled out his phone, dialing the number of his team. They had been waiting for this moment, and now it was time to coordinate their escape. "Status?" Marcus asked, his voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "We're in position, General," came the response from his team's leader. "We've got eyes on Dillard's men. They're closing in fast." Marcus cursed under his breath. They were running out of time. "Secure the exits. We need to get out of here now." As Marcus and James reached the back door, they saw movement in the yard beyond. Several armed men were approaching the building, clearly alerted to their presence. Dillard's people weren't giving up easily. "They're here," James said, his voice grim as he gripped his cane more tightly. "We don't have much time." Marcus's hand tightened around his gun as he positioned himself by the door. "We won't need much time. We just need to make it to the cars." With a single nod to his father, Marcus swung open the door, stepping out into the cool night air. The moment they were in the yard, they took off at a brisk pace, moving toward the parked vehicles. But before they could reach them, a shout rang out from behind. "There they are!" Marcus and James turned in unison, instinctively pulling their weapons and taking cover behind the nearest vehicles. The sound of gunfire rang out as Dillard's men opened fire, aiming at them with deadly precision. Marcus's heart raced, but his training took over. He fired back, returning shots as he moved toward a better position. "Dad, stay low!" Marcus shouted, moving quickly to cover his father as they advanced toward the getaway cars. The team was close, but they needed to break through Dillard's men to escape. James moved with surprising agility for his age, his cane no longer just a walking aid, but a weapon in his hands as he swung it at the nearest assailant who tried to get too close. The man stumbled backward, disoriented, and James took the opportunity to push forward, providing Marcus the cover he needed. "On your six, Dad!" Marcus yelled, looking back as they continued to advance. His eyes were focused, but his every move was calculated. The situation was fluid, dangerous, and evolving rapidly. But Marcus's mind raced faster than the gunfire around them. They reached the cars and their team was already in position, guns drawn and ready to fight. As Marcus and James jumped into the first vehicle, the sound of the engine roaring to life filled the air. The team followed, jumping into the remaining cars, and within moments they were speeding away from Dillard's estate, the sound of pursuit echoing behind them. Marcus glanced over at his father as they drove, the car weaving through the dark streets. "You good?" he asked, concern flickering in his eyes despite the adrenaline rush. James, though clearly winded and bruised from the chaos, gave him a faint smile. "I'm still here." The two of them shared a brief moment of silent understanding. They had just taken down one of the most dangerous men in the region, exposed his entire operation, and secured enough evidence to dismantle the hate network for good. But even as they drove away from the estate, they knew this was only one chapter in a much longer fight. As they reached the designated safe house where they would regroup, Marcus turned to his father. "We'll need to move quickly. Dillard's men will be hunting us now." James nodded. "I know, but we've got the hard part done. It's all downhill from here." But even as they parked the car and began to move into the safe house, a nagging feeling tugged at the back of Marcus's mind. He wasn't about to let his guard down. Not yet. This wasn't over. Dillard might be down, but the network was still alive, and Marcus knew that as long as it existed, the threat wasn't gone. Inside the safe house, Marcus and James laid out the evidence they had secured. It was overwhelming. Financial documents, proof of transactions, connections to political figures, and damning details of Dillard's involvement with private militias and extremist groups. The pieces of the puzzle had finally come together, and the network was unraveling faster than Marcus had anticipated. But even as he looked at the evidence in front of him, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. They had exposed one part of the network, but it wasn't the whole picture. There were still players in the shadows, pulling strings, and Marcus knew that it was only a matter of time before they tried to fight back. "This isn't over," Marcus said, his voice quiet but filled with determination. "We've taken down Dillard, but the fight's not finished. The rest of them are still out there." James stood beside him, his face calm but resolute. "We'll deal with them one step at a time, son. But for now, we've won, and that's enough." Marcus glanced at his father, the weight of the moment settling in. They had done something important today. They had struck a blow against a dangerous ideology, but they both knew the battle was far from over. As long as hatred and violence existed, they would have to keep fighting. For now, though, they allowed themselves a brief moment of victory. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The hours following the escape from Dillard's estate felt surreal. The adrenaline had faded, but the weight of their mission still hung heavy in the air. Marcus and James sat in the safe house, sifting through the documents they had recovered. The full extent of Dillard's operation was staggering, an entire network of hate groups, private militias, and far-reaching connections, all funded and orchestrated by one man. But despite the magnitude of the discovery, Marcus knew they had to stay focused. The work wasn't done yet. Dillard might be behind bars, but his associates in the larger network were still at large. The real battle would be dismantling what remained and making sure the entire operation came crumbling down. Marcus leaned forward, his mind sharp as ever, eyes scanning the evidence. "We've got everything we need to bring down the rest of them," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "The hard part is over. Now we make sure they can't regroup." James sat beside him, his face as unreadable as ever, though there was a sense of satisfaction in his eyes. "You're right, but don't get ahead of yourself. These people won't go down quietly, and we can't rush. They'll try to cover their tracks, scatter into the shadows." "I know," Marcus replied, nodding, "but we have one thing they don't. We have the truth, and we have the power to expose them. We've already made a huge impact." The older man smiled faintly, his pride in his son evident, but he also knew Marcus well enough to understand the drive within him. "We've done what we set out to do, but we've got to keep our eyes on the bigger picture. The fight isn't just about winning battles, it's about making sure we can stop them from doing this again." Marcus's jaw tightened. "And we will. We'll finish it." They spent the next few days working relentlessly, using the evidence to trace Dillard's contacts and identify the people still involved in the network. Law enforcement, military contacts, and their own team were all on high alert, pushing forward with an investigation that would cripple the remaining cells of the organization. The operation was swift. One by one, the remaining members of the network were arrested, their safe houses raided, and their connections exposed. The authorities, now fully aware of the scale of the operation, worked together to bring down Dillard's allies and dismantle the entire infrastructure. Every piece of evidence they had secured played a crucial role in cutting off the support the group had relied on for years. But Marcus and James knew that they couldn't simply rely on the system. While the arrests were taking place, Marcus was already working behind the scenes to ensure the full scope of the operation was exposed to the public. He knew the damage had been done, but he also understood that awareness was key to making sure it never happened again. One afternoon, as Marcus sat at his laptop in the living room of their safe house, an email popped up with the subject line, "Breaking news." His heart skipped a beat as he opened it. A live broadcast of a press conference flashed across the screen. The investigation into Thomas Dillard and his connections to domestic extremist groups was now the lead story across every major news network. Public outrage was at a peak as the details of the network's influence in violent activities were laid bare. Marcus stood up, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. He felt a surge of both relief and resolve. They had done it. The network was being exposed. The leaders were behind bars, and the truth was out for the world to see. But even as he watched the unfolding coverage, he knew that the fight wasn't over. There would always be another group, another threat to face, and he and his father would always be ready. James entered the room, a slight smile on his face as he saw Marcus watching the news. "It's done," James said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet pride. Marcus glanced over at him, his expression still serious. "For now, yeah, but we've seen this before. People like Dillard don't just disappear. There will be others trying to pick up where he left off." James nodded, understanding exactly what his son meant. "I know, but for today, we've won, and that's something we should hold on to." Marcus turned back to the screen, watching the press conference unfold as the investigators detailed their success in taking down Dillard's network. He could feel the weight of the moment settle in. For once, they had succeeded not just in taking down a criminal, but in stopping an entire movement that had threatened to grow out of control. They had made a difference. They had shown that no matter how deeply rooted hate could be, it could always be overcome. "We did it," Marcus whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. James, standing beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, we did, and we'll keep doing it as long as it takes." The moment stretched between them, filled with a sense of quiet accomplishment. They had fought side by side, father and son, against an enemy that seemed insurmountable. And they had won. It was a victory they both knew was just the beginning. The world had changed in the days that followed the collapse of Dillard's network. The public outcry had sparked new conversations about the rise of extremism and the need for stronger action against hate groups. The arrests made headlines, and the work that Marcus and James had done, though largely under the radar, had played a pivotal role in dismantling a dangerous organization. But as the dust settled, Marcus and James knew that they had to be ready for whatever came next. There would always be new threats, new battles to fight. They had learned that lesson the hard way, but they were prepared. The work wasn't over. The fight against hate, violence, and injustice was ongoing, and as long as they were able, they would be there to face it together. Marcus looked at his father, a quiet smile playing on his lips. "You know, I think we've earned a break." James chuckled, though his expression was thoughtful. "We have, but there's always more to do, son. There's always more to fix." Marcus nodded. "We'll keep fighting, no matter how long it takes." And with that, they walked out of the safe house, side by side, ready for whatever came next.